investment. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here today because there are some very interesting things happening in the dinar space right now, investment. And honestly, a lot of people are talking about pieces of the puzzle, but almost nobody is stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. Before we get into this, investment, quick disclaimer like always. This is not financial advice. I'm not giving you any dates. I'm not giving you any rates. Investment, and none of this should be taken as investment guidance. What we do here is look at information, news, financial signals, investment, and patterns that are happening around Iraq and the global financial system, and we discuss possibilities and scenarios. That's it. Investment. You always need to do your own research and make your own decisions. Now, with that said, something shifted in the dinar market recently. And when I say shifted, investment, I don't mean some dramatic headline where suddenly everything changed overnight. That's not how this process works. Investment. What I'm talking about is a subtle but very important change in behavior in the market, in the messaging, and even in the way institutions are positioning themselves. Investment. And this is where things start getting interesting. Most people watching dinar updates focus on the obvious things. They look for announcements. Investment. They watch the central bank of Iraq, they track exchange rates, and they wait for some kind of official statement that says everything has changed. Investment. But what many people miss is that markets often move before the public narrative catches up. Let me explain what I mean. Investment. Imagine you're watching a storm coming in from the ocean. The first thing you notice isn't the rain, it's the wind. Then the pressure drops. Investment. Then the clouds start shifting. The actual storm arrives last. Financial markets work in a very similar way. Right now we're seeing those early signals. Investment. Over the past several months, Iraq has been moving through a series of financial reforms that on the surface might look routine. Banking modernization, investment, digital payment expansion, currency management, anti-corruption efforts. These things sound boring to most people, but in the world of international finance, investment. These are the exact steps countries take when they're preparing to integrate more deeply with global markets. Investment. Think about it like upgrading the wiring inside a house before turning on the main power. You don't flip the switch first. Investment. You make sure everything behind the walls is ready. And this is exactly what Iraq appears to be doing. Now here's where the shift comes in. For years, investment. The dinar conversation has been dominated by speculation about what the currency could become. But recently, the conversation inside Iraq itself has started changing. Investment. Officials are talking less about maintaining stability at all costs and more about strengthening the value of the national currency. Investment. That's a subtle but very important difference. When a country is trying to defend a weak currency, the language usually focuses on control, restrictions, investment, and managing pressure. But when a country is preparing for growth, the language shifts toward confidence, investment, and integration with international financial systems. And we're starting to hear more of that second type of language. Investment. Another thing people aren't really talking about is how the banking sector inside Iraq has been evolving. Investment. A lot of smaller private banks have been under pressure to comply with international standards, especially when it comes to transparency, anti-money laundering measures, investment, and digital transaction tracking. Why does that matter? Because global financial networks, especially those connected to large institutions and foreign investment, don't interact freely with systems that lack compliance. Before a currency can operate smoothly in international markets, investment, the banking environment around it has to meet certain standards. And this is exactly the type of groundwork that takes years to build. Investment. But here's where the market shift becomes more noticeable. Some analysts have pointed out that demand patterns in the dinar market have started behaving differently. Investment. Instead of chaotic spikes driven purely by speculation, there are signs of more structured liquidity movement. That might sound technical, investment, but in simple terms, it means the flow of money is becoming more organized. That's something that tends to happen when institutions start paying closer attention. Investment. Now let's slow down for a moment because this part is important. When large financial players, banks, funds, international partners begin positioning around a currency, investment, they rarely make loud announcements, they move quietly, they adjust exposure, they watch policy changes, they evaluate risk, investment. And sometimes the only visible clue is a shift in how the market behaves. Think about how big cargo ships move in the ocean. In investment. From a distance, they look like they're barely moving at all. But once they start turning, it takes a long time for that movement to become obvious. investment. The dinar market right now feels a little bit like that. Another angle that doesn't get discussed enough is Iraq's broader economic positioning. Investment. Oil has always been the backbone of the Iraqi economy, but the country has been trying to diversify its financial infrastructure for years. Investment. There have been pushes toward regional trade agreements, infrastructure, investment, and even discussions about strengthening ties with multiple economic blocs. Investment. When you start connecting these dots, it becomes clear that Iraq isn't just thinking about today's economy. Investment. They're thinking about where they want to be 5 or 10 years from now. Currencies tend to reflect that long-term strategy. If a country wants to attract investment, expand trade, and increase economic influence, its currency eventually needs to function reliably in the international system. Investment. That doesn't necessarily mean an overnight jump or some dramatic moment everyone is waiting for. Sometimes it means a gradual process where policies, banking systems, investment, and market expectations all move into alignment, and that's why this recent shift in market behavior is getting attention from certain observers. Investment. It suggests that behind the scenes, the structure around the dinar might be evolving. Now, I want to be very clear here. None of this guarantees anything. Investment. Markets are complex, politics can change directions, and economic reforms often take longer than expected. Investment. But when you see multiple signals pointing in the same direction, banking modernization, policy language shifts, international compliance efforts, investment, and changing market patterns, it starts to paint a picture that looks a lot different from the chaos people imagined years ago. Investment. Instead of a sudden mysterious event, what we might actually be watching is a long-term financial transformation slowly reaching a more advanced stage. Investment. And here's the part that many people outside the financial world don't always realize. Major currency changes rarely begin with the currency itself. Investment. They begin with systems, regulations, international relationships, payment networks, institutional trust. By the time the currency becomes the headline, investment, the real work has usually already been done. Investment. That's why watching the infrastructure around the dinar can sometimes be more revealing than watching the exchange rate itself. Investment. Now let's talk about something else that's quietly adding pressure to this situation: global currency dynamics. Investment. The international monetary system has been going through a lot of adjustments over the last decade. Digital payments, cross-border transaction networks. Investment. Central bank digital currency discussions and evolving trade alliances have all been reshaping how money moves around the world. Investment. Countries that want to remain competitive in this environment have to adapt. Iraq, despite all of its challenges, investment sits in a very strategic geographic and economic position. It connects major regions of the Middle East, holds enormous natural resources, investment, and has been rebuilding its financial institutions step by step. When you combine that with ongoing reform discussions, investment, you start to see why some observers believe Iraq is trying to position itself for a more prominent role in regional finance. And if that's the case, investment, the dinar, eventually becomes part of that story. But again, not necessarily in the way many people expect. The real shift might not be a sudden announcement. Investment. It might be a gradual tightening of systems until one day the market simply begins treating the currency differently. Investment. And when markets change perception, that's when things start moving. There's another interesting detail that a few financial analysts have pointed out recently. Investment. For years, conversations about the dinar were mostly happening among retail speculators, individuals holding physical notes, watching updates, investment, and hoping for future changes. But lately, the tone of some discussions has started moving into more analytical territory. Investment. People are talking about monetary policy adjustments, reserve management, regional trade settlement, and international clearing systems. Investment. Those aren't the kinds of topics that usually dominate purely speculative markets. Investment. They're the kinds of discussions that appear when people start analyzing real economic strategy. Investment. And that shift in conversation can sometimes signal that the story itself is evolving. Now, again, none of this should be taken as confirmation of any specific outcome. Investment, but if you step back and look at the broader landscape, the banking reforms, the policy messaging, the market behavior, and the global financial environment, it does seem like something important may be developing beneath the surface. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Investment. And sometimes the quiet shifts are the ones that matter most. All right, guys, we're going to pause right there for now. Investment, because in the next part, we're going to talk about something even more interesting. Investment. The signals coming from international financial systems and how they might connect to what's happening inside Iraq. Investment. because once you start looking at that side of the equation, the story becomes even more fascinating. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Before we continue investment, just a quick reminder, like always, this is not financial advice. I'm not giving you any dates. I'm not giving you any rates in investment, and nothing in this discussion should be taken as investment guidance. We're simply looking at information, global financial movements, investment, and possible scenarios surrounding Iraq and the dinar. Always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Investment. Now, in the last part, we talked about how the dinar market appears to be shifting quietly, not with huge announcements, but through structural changes in banking, investment policy language, and market behavior. Those are the kinds of early signals that tend to appear before bigger financial transitions. Investment, but now we need to zoom out even further, because once you look beyond Iraq itself, something else begins to come into focus: investment. And honestly, this is the part almost nobody is explaining. When a currency begins moving toward a new phase in the global system, it rarely happens in isolation. Investment. Currencies are deeply connected to international payment networks, trade settlements, central bank relationships, and global liquidity flows. Investment. So if Iraq is adjusting its financial infrastructure, the next logical question becomes this: what are the international systems around it doing at the same time? Investment. And this is where things start getting very interesting. Over the past several years, investment. The global financial system has been slowly upgrading the way cross-border payments operate. Investment. Older systems that used to take days to settle transactions are gradually being replaced with faster, more transparent digital settlement frameworks. Investment. These changes are not just about convenience, they're about control, compliance, and efficiency in international trade. Investment. Think about it like upgrading an entire highway system. Before more traffic can move smoothly, the roads themselves have to be rebuilt. Investment. Now here's where Iraq enters the picture. If Iraq wants its currency to operate more freely in international markets, investment. Its banking system has to be able to communicate with these upgraded networks. That means compliance standards, digital payment tracking, investment, and coordination with international clearing systems all have to be in place. And over the last few years, that's exactly what we've been seeing Iraq work toward. Investment. Now, again, this doesn't mean something happens overnight. These kinds of financial transitions usually take years. But when the infrastructure starts aligning, investment, the possibilities begin to expand. Let me give you a simple scenario. Imagine a country that wants to attract large foreign investment projects. Investment, infrastructure development, energy partnerships, construction contracts, things like that. Investment. Investors from other nations don't want to operate in a financial environment where currency movement is unpredictable or banking systems are outdated. They want stability, transparency, and efficiency. So before those investments arrive at scale, the financial system itself has to evolve. Investment. This is why some observers believe the reforms happening in Iraq right now are not just about fixing internal problems. Investment. They're also about preparing the country to operate at a different level within the international economic system. And if that preparation continues, investment. The dinar eventually becomes part of that larger shift. But here's the twist that people don't always consider. Investment. Sometimes the biggest currency changes don't begin with the currency at all, they begin with trade. Investment. Trade flows are one of the most powerful forces shaping how currencies behave. When a country increases exports, expands trade partnerships, investment, and becomes a more central player in regional commerce, demand for its currency can start growing naturally. Now think about Iraq's position geographically. Investment. It sits at a crossroads between the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. That makes it strategically important for transportation corridors, energy routes, investment, and regional commerce. In fact, there have already been discussions about major infrastructure projects designed to connect Iraq more directly with neighboring economies. Investment projects like transportation corridors, logistics hubs, and energy pipelines could eventually turn Iraq into a major connector between different economic regions. Investment. And if that kind of economic expansion continues, the financial system supporting it has to grow as well. Investment. Now let's talk about another signal that's been quietly developing. Over the last decade, investment, many countries around the world have been reevaluating how they manage their national currencies in relation to global markets. Investment. Some have been adjusting exchange policies, some have been increasing gold reserves, and others have been strengthening central bank independence. Why? Investment, because the global monetary landscape itself is changing. The dominance of certain financial structures that existed for decades is gradually evolving as new economic powers rise and regional trade blocs strengthen. Countries want more flexibility, more control over their financial destiny, and stronger protection against global shocks. For Iraq investment, this environment actually creates an interesting opportunity. Instead of simply maintaining a static monetary system, Iraq could potentially redesign its financial architecture in a way that supports long-term economic expansion. Now again, investment, that doesn't mean some dramatic overnight revaluation. Real financial systems rarely work like that. What it could mean is something more strategic: investment, a carefully managed transition where the currency gradually gains strength as the economic foundation supporting it becomes more stable. Investment. And when you look at the reforms Iraq has been implementing: banking compliance, digital payment adoption, monetary policy adjustments, investment. Those are exactly the kinds of steps countries take when preparing for deeper financial integration. But there's another layer to this story that's easy to overlook: confidence. Currency values are influenced not only by economic numbers, but also by perception. Investors, institutions, investment, and trading partners all make decisions based on how confident they feel about a country's stability and long-term direction. If confidence grows, capital flows in. Investment, if confidence drops, capital flows out. So one of the biggest challenges Iraq has faced over the years has been rebuilding that confidence after decades of conflict, investment, sanctions, and political instability. But slowly, piece by piece, that perception has been improving. Investment, international companies have returned to participate in energy development. Infrastructure agreements have been signed. Regional cooperation has increased. Investment, even the domestic banking sector has been pushed toward modernization. Each of these steps may seem small individually, investment, but collectively they change how the world views the Iraqi economy. And when perception changes, financial markets start paying attention. Investment. Now here's an example that might help illustrate this. Imagine two countries with similar natural resources and similar populations. One has a stable banking system. Investment, transparent financial policies, and growing international partnerships. The other struggles with outdated financial infrastructure and unpredictable regulations. Which country do you think global investors will choose? The answer is obvious. That's why Iraq's ongoing reforms matter more than most headlines suggest. Investment. They're not just internal policy adjustments, they're signals to the outside world, signals that the country is preparing to operate differently. Investment. And when those signals begin aligning with market behavior, analysts start asking deeper questions. Investment. There's also something happening psychologically in the dinar community that's worth mentioning. For years, discussions around the dinar were dominated by hype cycles. People waited for rumors, dramatic predictions, and sudden breakthroughs that never seemed to arrive. That created frustration and skepticism among many observers. Investment, but lately the tone has been shifting slightly. Instead of focusing purely on rumors, more conversations are starting to revolve around structural changes, investment banking reform, international compliance, trade corridors, economic diversification, and monetary policy strategy. That shift in focus might seem small, investment, but it actually reflects a more mature understanding of how currencies evolve. Real currency transformations don't happen because someone flips a switch. Investment, they happen because an entire economic ecosystem changes. And that ecosystem includes government policy, central bank independence, international partnerships, investment. Banking, technology, and market confidence all working together. So when we talk about the dinar market shifting, we're not necessarily talking about a single event. Investment. We're talking about momentum that builds slowly, sometimes quietly, until eventually the financial world begins reacting to it. Investment. And when that reaction starts, things can accelerate very quickly. Now, in the next part, we're going to explore one final piece of this puzzle. Investment, something that connects Iraq's internal reforms with potential future market reactions. Because once you understand how financial markets respond to structural change, investment, you start to see why some analysts believe the dinar story may be entering a completely different phase than what people expected years ago.